Hello, class. This is Maxwell. This is for homework assignment for D.L. Moody Theological Seminary for Distant Learning. The homework assignment today calls for us to do an article or do a review on the articles that we read for this week lesson. And I chose to do Say and Do by Fred Cardock. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Out of the biblical, out of the arts and craft of biblical preaching. So I chose that one. It was pretty interesting. And the number one question opens up: what is the main thesis and supporting idea of the articles, of the article? And it's how to choose a sermon form that helps hearers experience the truth. So what he was trying to do is to help us as preachers to set up our sermon form that helps hearers to experience the truth, which is very vital in our preaching. You know, we want to be heard. And I like what Haddon Robinson says in his book, Biblical Preaching, is that we're not teaching the Bible, but we're talking to people about themselves from the Bible. So in Say and Do, Fred does a great job. It was great reading. And number two is, how can these ideas be applied to help his or her on preaching? How can these ideas be applied? Simply is just, I like what he says in his book. He says, sometime in a sermon you're just teaching, but in other sermons you're trying to create another experience. Some sermons are to encourage, to challenge, to inspire, to persuade, to correct, and to clear up. So as preachers, we have to know that sometimes, sermons, we're just not teaching the sermons, but, we're trying to get the people to experience that sermon. So there's many ways, and I like what he says too. We do not just go to the dictionary and to get definitions of freedom. We want to preach a sermon that provides the experience of things we're talking about. Good sermons do what they are talking about and talk about what they are doing. So I like that. So those are ways that the ideal can be applied to our own preaching. And then he talks about number three, what help can this article provide for other preachers? Just know what you're trying to do. Just know what you're trying to get the audience to understand. No, you're just not saying something, but you are doing something. Then he uses another phrase here. He says the key to having an effective sermon form is to know what you want to say before you start working into your sermon. So I found that to be very essential, is to know what we're going to say before we even start the process of the sermon. And he says, in other words, let the study to get a message and preparation of the form of the material be separate stages. This releases my imagination to ask, how can I get this across? So that's very vital. And so those are. It was, like I said, it was a great article. And what help can this article provide for other preachers? It's just know what you're trying to get the audience to say, and the key is having an effective sermon is to know what you're going to say before you start working into your sermon, which is very important. So say and do. So Fred did a marvelous job in this article that he put out, and and I like what he says this too. He said, I don't always have the same structure, the same old outline from the results from boiling a text down to its essential point and then outlining that point. That's not always congenial for people's experience of the scripture. So that's just one thing though, is just know that as we building our sermon, that know what you are trying to say, and we're not just saying something, we are doing something. And so that really helped me, is to know that I'm just not saying something, I am doing something. And also in the arts of biblical preaching, Haddon Robinson said in his sermon, he says that you got to know your aim. So as we're preparing our sermon and get ready to preach, he said sermon is like a hunter's gun. And he said when the hunter goes out to hunt, he points the gun at his aim, at his game. He pulls the trigger and watch for his game to fall. So that should be how us as preachers, that we should aim at what we know we want to do, what we want to know what the sermon is going to accomplish, and then watch to see the results of it. So this is, like I said, a great lesson. And there's a saying that Dr. Tony Evans always say, is that we can preach truth, but the Holy Spirit parts truth. All right, thank you. Have a blessed day.